There are lots of notable periods in English history, and I just wanted to briefly go through some of the time periods that are relevant, really. So you have the Celtic migrations that start seemingly after the end of the first ice age, when it wasn't a frozen tundra and it was actually possible to inhabit the island, but particularly sort of 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, people started coming to the British Isles, and these people are broadly referred to as Celtic, but we'll get on to why that word isn't necessarily ideal to describe people, because it's so general and loose that you lose a lot of nuance there. Of course, you have the Roman occupation, which started in 43 AD and carried on all the way until 410, when they withdrew. And then you have the sort of Germanic groups settling in the British Isles. Then you have the Vikings. Then you have the Normans. And then you have the Renaissance, which introduces lots of new terms. Of course, this is sort of getting towards early modern English, your sort of Shakespeare times. And then you've got the imperial exports, because of course Britain became a global power, and although we exchanged ideas and language and culture with other people, that you always get something in return, don't you? So with that sort of rough overview out the way of how things have worked, it's worth mentioning the origin of most modern day languages, because they seem to have a shared origin, and that is in this shared Indo-European language, as it is called. And there's this picture that will be put on screen now, showing some of the shared words between lots of different languages. And that's not necessarily cross-pollination, although that does certainly happen, but it seems like there's enough similarities of languages that may have actually developed in isolation of one another, in which it indicates that there's a shared point of origin. And so if we have a look at this image here, it's a sort of artistic representation of the Indo-European language tree, and it splits off into two different main trunks, if you will. There's the Indo-Iranian, of course, meaning in the Ind part is, of course, in reference to the Indus, as in the Indus Valley or India, and so it's pretty self-evident what languages that is referring to. And of course, Iranian, you know where that space, right, is the sort of Persian languages, I suppose. But we're going to be focusing largely on Europe, because of course West Asia is not really relevant to the history of the English language, at least not until colonial times. So with European, there are three main branches out of that trunk. You've got the Slavic languages, so obviously things like Russian, Polish, Czech. You've got the Romance languages, so Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. I mean, this is unsurprising to most people. This isn't really news. And of course, the Germanic ones, which of course English is part of. And of course, there's German. It doesn't seem to, I think there's some sort of Scandinavian ones, although they branch off earlier than a lot of the others, obviously English being one of the more recent ones, because of course it was an amalgam of all of the other branches on that. I'm saying the word branch a lot, but you get the gist, right? The point being is that there was a point whereby European languages would have been a lot closer together, and there would have been a lot more commonality, and unsurprisingly, it's diverted further and further apart. But I think about 46% of the world's population speaks an Indo-European language, so almost half of all people on Earth speak a language with a shared origin, which I found very interesting. I thought that it would have been a lot more sort of organic and modular, in that people in different locations would be somewhat isolated, and they would develop their own languages in independence of other people. But of course, that's not really how language works, is it? It's more that people would have had some sort of working language before this Proto-Indo-European, but it seems to be the dominant one that has spread, and then people have developed it further, because you can't just create a language out of thin air. There has to be something that comes before. There's got to be a gentle progression, because of course you don't just wake up one day and invent a new language. It probably takes a lot of concerted effort actually to create something like that, at least over a long period of time and incrementally. But there have been lots of attempts in academia to argue which geographic location actually corresponds to this origin point, and this has been going on for about 200 years, so I'm certainly not going to be decisively resolving this, but there's been some research published relatively recently that's worth looking at, and I am going to in a second. But first I'm going to introduce the two sort of competing hypotheses, if you will. The first and dominant one, really, depending on who you ask, is that language seems to originate in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, so what is sort of now areas of Ukraine and southern Russia. And so that would be the origin point in which lots of languages spread out from. And the main competing hypothesis for this one is it's got two different names really, either the Anatolian, as in the Anatolian Peninsula, which is modern-day Turkey, or farming hypothesis, which suggests an older origin which was tied to modern agricultural techniques. And by modern, I mean in the sum of all of human history, not combine harvesters and tractors, but the domestication of things like wheat, for example, because, and of course, Anatolia is relatively close to the Fertile Crescent, and lots of the places where it is suspected that some of the first peoples to domesticate crops came from. And we've talked about this before, both in Epochs and in Contemplations. But I think that this one is perhaps a little bit stronger because, of course, with this revolutionary means of getting food, in that you don't have to hunt or gather anymore, you can stay in the same spot and tend to a plot of land, and then you can build a civilization because you're in a stationary position. You can build, say, stone buildings, you can build towns, cities. You're not constantly nomadic, moving around, following game. And so this seems like a prerequisite, to my mind, of having a shared culture, because it would have been fairly difficult to have a large enough culture to have these sort of more sophisticated languages, because you have a smaller human group. You don't necessarily need to develop as sophisticated a language as you might in, say, a town or city, where you might be talking to people who you haven't actually met before. It's possible, maybe there's trade, but of course this is a little bit down the line. So this sort of Anatolian area as well is sort of south of the Caucasus as well, so sort of Georgia. It's a pretty broad area. There'll probably be a map on screen where you can see. But this is also an important area for human history more generally, and I covered in my mini-series talking about the origin of humanity, funnily enough, that there's a place in Georgia, Dmanisi, where there were early hominids, certainly not, it wouldn't be fair to call them humans as we know them today. 1.8 million years ago, they still hadn't discovered fire or later Stone Age tools. They were still using slightly sharpened rocks. They hadn't fashioned them into, say, spears or bows yet. And they were actually chewing up the food for an elderly, toothless person who would be incapable of eating it otherwise, which shows that even 2 million years ago, our human ancestors cared for their elderly and clearly had bonds with them, because this would be a very difficult and strenuous thing to do. You certainly couldn't imagine an animal who would chew up food and then basically spit it out and give it to another animal that wasn't, say, their offspring. Obviously, birds tend to do that. They eat food and then regurgitate it back. But it's it's rare to see that outside of raising young, is the point I'm trying to make. But it's just an interesting place for human history, that sort of area. And I think that there's a lot of evidence for that. And this recent paper that I was talking about is that of Hegarty et al., and it was published this year in July. So it's relatively recent. There's not been enough time necessarily to get a reasonable impression from the linguistic community, which I'm certainly not a part of. But it seems like a pretty good attempt at understanding this origin point problem, because they were basically a team of linguists and geneticists, and they just used the best evidence they could from each of the respective fields to try and pinpoint two locations based on both, obviously, linguistics and genetics, to try and corroborate between the two fields where these origin points may lie. And their conclusion was that there's a sort of hybrid hypothesis, and this may seem like fence sitting, but I think there is something to it, in that if you're being pedantic, the point of origin is probably this Anatolian point of origin from about 8,100 years ago, they claim. And so that's based at the bottom of the Caucasus, sort of at the base of the Anatolian Peninsula, where it attaches to the Asian continent, I suppose you could say. And then this fed onto this other centre in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which then spread to Europe about 5,000 years ago, they seem to think.
Thank you for watching that clip from my series Contemplations. If you want to sign up to the website for £5 a month, you can access that series, which comes out 1 PM every Saturday. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.